Once there was a king, as there often is, and this king was a particularly nice king. He had 3 beautiful daughters, 3 princesses, and he made sure that they were well educated, that they were well brought up, that they had lots of experiences meeting people round about them, and they grew up to be fine young women. And the king had aspirations for his daughters to make fine matches and marry princes and kings and merchants from all over the region. And indeed, they did grow up into fine, beautiful young women. And one day the king gathered his daughters together and said, "Now daughters, I feel that you have had a good life so far, and I want to find good matches for you for the future. But I want to know," feel free to move if the smoke's getting too much, "I want to know how much you love me." So he asked the oldest daughter, "How much do you love me?" And she said, "Oh father, I love you so much. I love you like gold and silver." And the father said, "Oh, that's wonderful. Gold and silver, that's amazing. You must love me so much. I will find a rich king that you can marry, and you will have as much gold and silver as ever you want." And then he turned to his second daughter and said, "You, and how much do you love me?" And she said, "Oh father, I love you so much. I love you as much as diamonds and rubies and pearls and all the jewels." And her father said, "Oh, that's wonderful. You love me so much. I will find a rich merchant, and he will buy you as many diamonds and emeralds and pearls as you will ever want." And then he turned to his youngest daughter, Anne, and he said, "And Anne, how much do you love me?" And Anne looked up at her father and said, "Oh father, I love you so much. I love you as much as soil." "As much as soil," he said. "As much as you love me like dirt. You love me like dirt. How dare you? After everything I have done for you, after everything that I have given you, get out of my house. Get out, just go. You in fact don't take anything. You can get a loaf of bread from the kitchen and that is it. Get out." And the Queen tried to persuade him not to banish their daughter, but he wouldn't listen. He had been offended. He had been offended to his court and he would not listen. And so Anne took a loaf of bread and some cheese from the kitchen, and she said goodbye to the servants and to her home, and she left. And she walked across the kingdom. She walked for days and days until she got to the edge of the kingdom, and there was a giant forest, a big green giant forest on the edge of the kingdom. And she entered it with some trepidation. She'd never left her father's lands before. She'd only gone a little way when she found an old woman, bent nearly double with age and arthritis, and this woman was picking up sticks for firewood. And Anne said, "Oh, can I help you?" And the woman looked at her a little bit suspiciously. She'd never seen such a fine young woman before. And she said, "Well, yes, please help me if you're happy to." And Anne helped her to collect firewood and helped her back to her little tumble-down cottage. And the old woman said, "Have you no family? Where are you from?" And Anne said, "No, I have no family anymore, and I have nowhere to go." And the woman said, "Well, that's good for me, I mean, would you like to move in, and maybe you can share my cottage and share some tasks, and I will teach you about the woods and the ways of things." And Anne moved in with the woman, and they lived quite contentedly. While she was there, she learnt how to forage and gather medicines and different plants. She learnt how to bake bread, she learnt how to hunt, how to skin animals, how to make all sorts of different things. And she grew into a fine, strong woman. And she heard that her oldest sister had married a king. And she heard that her middle sister had married a merchant far off. But she also heard rumours from her father's kingdom. You see, the trees had begun to wither, and the crops had failed, and the drought was really bad, and the crops had failed year after year, and things sounded pretty bad. In fact, it got so bad that they could grow nothing anymore in that land. And eventually the king and queen had to leave their home because there was not a scrap of food left in the entire kingdom. And the king and queen travelled. They travelled to the west, and eventually they reached a great forest. And in that forest they found a tumble-down cottage, and outside there was an old woman. And they asked the old woman if there was any chance that maybe she would have a heel of bread or something for them to eat, because they were starving. They had no food because nothing grew in their land anymore. And the old woman looked at them, and she knew Anne's story. And she said, oh, but surely nothing that comes from the soil is of value. And the king said, well, what do you mean? And the woman smiled and said, do you remember what your daughter told you about loving you as much as the soil? And the king realised that actually if you do not have good soils and you cannot grow anything, then you have nothing. And gold and silver and all the jewels in the world are worthless without it. And he realised at that moment that his youngest daughter Anne had loved him the most.
Okay.
Here you go.
Right.